I fell in love with someone else. First off, I want to acknowledge that the following is horrible and I feel the utmost guilt because of it. To start off, I'm a married man in my 20s and I got married very young. My wife and I have never been very similar, and I love her, but the reality is we don't get along very well. She's incredibly introverted and I'm a social butterfly. I tend to be gentle and she is very blunt. I'm messy, she's incredibly organized. Basically, marriage hasn't been easy. With that being said, I do love her. Now for the confession. Last year, me and a younger girl became really close friends. I'll call her Elise. She was incredibly sweet and had a boyfriend. She just happened to be in my social circle and we eventually started Snapchatting and talking more frequently. This is usually a boundary I wouldn't cross with another girl, but I was clearly not thinking wisely. I just enjoyed talking to her. My wife knew Elise and I talked, but she wasn't really aware of the increasing frequency. It would become almost all day, every day. Every time Elise and I would see each other, it was always among friends, never alone. As time went on, we clearly were catching feelings for each other, just judging by the flirtatiousness of our texts. Nothing was ever said explicitly, but when we did see each other in person, it was clear just by the way we looked at each other that there was more going on. It was like we could communicate telepathically. We were so similar. Months went by like this, but then suddenly the frequency of communication dropped significantly on her end. I was a bit confused and I asked her bluntly about why she was not talking as much. She responded with something like, "I'm trying not to message you as much because I feel like I'm getting too clingy, you know?" I understood what she was trying to say. She was becoming too attached, and so was I. I just decided to speak a bit more honestly about our relationship and said that I was developing feelings and becoming really attached, so that we should probably talk much less. She agreed. We were both a bit sad about it. This lasted for about a week, and before you know it, we were talking again like we'd never had that previous conversation. More months went by, and the language we were using was becoming more romantic, but not necessary, like, "I want to kiss you," or "I want to cuddle," or anything like that, but just close enough. It seemed there was this hidden line that we both really didn't want to cross, because if we crossed it, the whole thing might fall apart. We still would see each other in person, but because we only saw each other in groups, we could only exchange small flirtations and give each other the look. I'm a musician and a producer, and eventually I was writing songs about her and sending them to her. She obviously knew what they were about, and quite frankly, she absolutely loved it, and so did I. It was such a great way to communicate how I felt. Things continued to escalate. Eventually, we both admitted to having sexual dreams about each other. Sending hearts and messages, complimenting each other's physical appearances far more often. I wouldn't say we necessarily sexted on Snapchat, but there was certainly less clothing than there was before. It was just so hard not to talk to her. It seemed like we were built for each other's personalities and had this energy that I'd never had with anybody else before. I didn't want this to be a weird fling. I now wanted her to be my wife. But I was guilty, and I was feeling it. Even though talking with her was amazing, it was becoming increasingly stressful sneaking around talking to her, and I was growing increasingly aware of how horrible I was for talking to her. So I attempted to fix it. I told her that I was in love with her and I didn't know what to do. Ultimately, I told her that we need to stop talking. This was heartbreaking for me, as I really did want to share my life with her, but it was the right thing to do. She had a really rather odd response. It didn't make sense at the time, but later I figured it out. She said, "I'm sorry, I don't really see you in that same way." I was seriously blindsided by this. It didn't make any sense given any of the evidence. I even pushed back against it slightly, and she said, "Do you think I'm lying?" And I didn't suppose she would lie about something like that. So I believed her and figured this would make things easier. If she didn't love me, what was the point? Was sort of my logic. Some weeks go by, I put a lot of willpower into not talking to her. I attempted to distract myself with as much as I could, but she started messaging me again. It was very friendly at first, and I think it was our best attempt at just talking as friends, but it didn't last very long. Over the next 2 months, we were now more romantic than ever. In my head, however, I just wanted to ask her the question, "Do you love me?" because I was still very much confused by our prior conversation. She clearly loved me. There was no doubt in my mind, but I didn't want to ask because I felt like everything would fall apart again. We were talking on the phone a lot more now, for hours at a time late at night. We still couldn't get enough of each other. But I had to ask her the question. I asked her if she loved me. She said something like, "You're not going to like my answer." And I pushed back again a little harder, saying, "Elise, this doesn't make any sense. You not loving me makes no sense." Understand, I'm condensing paragraphs into short sentences, but eventually she admitted she absolutely did love me. She just had never wanted to say it, because then she has the guilt of loving somebody that's married. We ended up talking on the phone for hours about how much we loved each other. It was cathartic, but the call ultimately ended in tears about how we have to stop talking again. We both wanted to talk forever, but both wanted to do the right thing. After that, we had a week with absolutely no contact until she messaged me that she was excited to see me at an event she knew I was going to be at. I feel I'm leaving out so many details, as this whole thing takes place over the course of a year, but one thing I think I should note is that we had never really touched over that whole period of time. Besides maybe a touch on the arm here and there, we had never even hugged, which is just crazy looking back on it. But it was the next day, and we were both at this public event. I'm purposely being very vague about what it actually was. We were just having friendly conversation. I think we both knew it was a little awkward given the circumstances, but by no effort of our own, we found ourselves alone. In this moment, I knew I had to hold her at least once, even if it was just a means of saying that final goodbye. We were going to go grab some coffee, but I took an opportunity. There was an empty office room nearby, and I told her to come here and led her to the office. I locked the door behind us and flung my arms around her. This was one of the most powerful moments of my life. We held each other for probably about 15 minutes standing in this office, and we were both sobbing. We had both wanted to feel each other for so long, and now this would probably be the last time we would feel each other. Eventually, we stopped and looked at each other straight into the eyes, inches away. We kissed. No idea who initiated it, but we kissed passionately for probably 20 minutes. I wanted to be locked in that room forever. I honestly thought that this could never happen, and no part of me thought it actually would. It was like we were communicating in a way we never had before, and I don't think I'll ever feel that complete again. It was like we shared the same spirit. Despite the horribleness of it all, it was undoubtedly an incredibly powerful moment, something that felt like it could only happen in a movie. Our time was up, and we had to get out of that office before anybody noticed. I felt incredibly numb the rest of the day. It was like I had no idea how to process what had actually happened. I thought I would feel irreparably guilty, but the reality is I was in shock. I called Elise later that night, and we talked about what had happened. I didn't even know what we were going to say, but it mainly ended up being about how magical of a moment that was, and concluded with us saying we need a day to process this and figure out how to move forward the next day. We were both in disbelief. The next day, the guilt really started to hit me. The high had worn off slightly. We agreed to talk on the phone that night. We ended up FaceTiming for what felt like forever. We both knew this was really where it was going to end, and we wanted the call to last as long as possible. We smiled, we laughed, we cried. We were reminiscing about the good times we had. We shared our guilt for what we had done, and ultimately formed a game plan. We would delete all our social media for a certain amount of time to decrease the likelihood we would reach out to each other again. We knew that seeing each other posting about anything would be triggers for us. After many more tears, we told each other that we loved each other one last time and said goodbye. Since that day, I've felt awful, and I mean truly awful. I want nothing more than to be with her, but ultimately I need to be a good husband. I'm trying my best to attend to my marriage and strengthen that relationship, even though it's so much harder to do. You might be asking, will you tell your wife that any of this happened? At this point, no. I would ruin both her and Elise's lives. I'm just trying to bring her the most happiness I can now, even though I feel so empty inside. Perhaps that will change in the future, but I've not the will to do it now. It's too catastrophic. I had to get that off my chest in some way.